The sky over Charleston was painted with the soft orange glow of the setting sun, casting long shadows over the grand estate of Eleanor Whitmore. The Whitmore mansion stood tall, a testament to old money and Southern aristocracy. Eleanor, a 63-year-old widow, had inherited her late husband's fortune, oil money that had kept her in the highest circles of society. But despite her wealth and power, Eleanor was lonely. She had been married to Harrison Whitmore for over 40 years, a marriage built on status rather than love. When he passed away 5 years ago, she found herself craving something she had never dared explore in her youth: passion. That's when she met Marcus Green. Marcus was everything Eleanor was not. He was 28, charming, full of life, and, most importantly, dangerous in a way she found intoxicating. He was a jazz musician who played in a private club downtown, and when she first saw him, she was drawn to him like a moth to a flame. He was tall, with deep brown skin, intelligent eyes, and a smile that made her forget her age. It was a scandal waiting to happen, but Eleanor didn't care. She had money, influence, and the ability to make things disappear when necessary. Their affair started discreetly. Expensive gifts, secret getaways, whispered promises between silk sheets. Eleanor had never felt this alive. She convinced herself that Marcus loved her, not just her money. She told herself that their relationship was more than just a young man using an older woman for financial security. But one evening, everything changed. It was a humid Saturday night when Eleanor arrived at Marcus's downtown apartment, a penthouse she had paid for. She had told her friends she was on a trip to New York for the weekend, a lie she often used to cover her indiscretions. She knocked on the door expecting to be greeted by Marcus's usual playful grin. Instead, she was met with silence. Her heart pounded. She tried the door. It was unlocked. Stepping inside, she felt something in the air, something off. The apartment smelled different, like cheap perfume mixed with sweat. As she walked into the bedroom, her breath caught in her throat. Marcus was in bed with a woman. She was younger, curvier, with warm brown skin and thick curls that tumbled over her bare shoulders. But what struck Eleanor the most was the way Marcus was looking at her. It was not lust or desire. It was love. Eleanor didn't say a word. She simply turned and left, her chest tight, her fingers digging into her palm. The next morning, she hired a private investigator. For 2 weeks, she barely ate or slept. When the report finally landed on her desk, she poured herself a drink before opening it. The file contained photos, receipts, and records. Marcus was not only cheating, he was married. His wife, Jasmine Green, was a school teacher. They had been married for 6 years and had a 3-year-old son. Eleanor's hands trembled as she read through the documents. Her Marcus, her lover, had never been hers at all. He had played her for a fool. That was the moment Eleanor decided that Marcus Green had to die. Homicide of Marcus Green. Marcus Green, male, 28, African American. Jazz musician, August 17, 2023-323 Palm View Drive, Charleston, victim's residence. Gunshot wound to the chest, close range, .38 caliber. Under investigation approximately 10:45 p.m., neighbors reported hearing a single gunshot from Marcus Green's apartment. Upon arrival, officers found the victim collapsed in the living room. The body showed no signs of struggle, suggesting the shooter was someone the victim knew. The murder weapon was missing, and the apartment had been carefully cleaned. No fingerprints, no DNA, nothing. A deliberate killing. One thing was clear. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This was personal. The night Marcus Green died, Eleanor Whitmore was seated at an exclusive gala for the Charleston Art Society, dressed in a deep emerald gown that shimmered under the chandeliers. She laughed at all the right moments, sipped on champagne, and engaged in polite conversation with Charleston's elite. She even made sure to be caught in several photographs, her presence undeniable. When the clock struck 10, she excused herself, claiming exhaustion. Her driver, Harold, took her home, and security cameras at her estate recorded her walking through the grand front doors at precisely 10:30 p.m. By 10:45 p.m., Marcus was dead. Detective Samuel Briggs had seen enough murders in his 20 years on the force to know when something wasn't right. Charleston had its fair share of crimes: drugs, gang violence, the occasional crime of passion. But this smelled different. Briggs stood in the doorway of Marcus's penthouse, looking around the pristine apartment. The crime scene was too clean, too calculated. A single bullet to the chest, no forced entry, no signs of struggle. Whoever did this wasn't in a panic. They knew exactly what they were doing. A young officer approached, his face pale. "Detective, we found his phone." Briggs took the evidence bag, glancing at the cracked screen. "Anything interesting?" The officer swallowed. "A lot of missed calls from a woman named Eleanor Whitmore." Briggs's eyebrows lifted slightly. He had heard the name before. Everyone in Charleston knew Eleanor. Old money, high society, the widow of a powerful oil tycoon. The kind of woman who didn't associate with people like Marcus. But when he scrolled further, he found messages, dozens of them. "I miss you. I need to see you. You lied to me. You're married. You think you can humiliate me. I swear to God, Marcus, you'll regret this." Briggs exhaled slowly. He had just found his prime suspect. The next morning, Detective Briggs arrived at the Whitmore estate. The gates were tall, the security tight, but Eleanor had agreed to speak with him. She met him in the grand sitting room, dressed impeccably in a silk robe, her silver hair perfectly styled. "Detective, I'm afraid I don't understand why you're here," she said, her voice cool. Briggs sat across from her, studying her. She was calm, too calm. He had interrogated hundreds of suspects, and guilt usually showed itself in the smallest ways. A twitch of the eye, a nervous tick, a shake in the hands. But Eleanor gave him nothing. "Mrs. Whitmore, I assume you knew Marcus Green?" Her lips tightened. "Yes, I knew him." "How well?" She tilted her head. "We were close." Briggs nodded. "You were at a gala last night, correct?" "Yes, you can check. There are pictures, witnesses. We already did." "You left at 10. "Yes, detective. And I arrived home at 10:30. You can check my security cameras. My driver will confirm." Briggs leaned forward. "Mrs. Whitmore, Marcus was shot at 10:45. That gives you 15 minutes unaccounted for." Eleanor met his gaze without flinching. "Detective, are you suggesting that a 63-year-old woman drove across the city, broke into a man's home, shot him, and left without a trace? All in 15 minutes?" Briggs didn't smile. "I've seen stranger things." She sighed, shaking her head. "I love Marcus, detective. Yes, I was angry when I found out he was married. But murder, that's ridiculous." Briggs watched her carefully. She had crafted a perfect alibi. Too perfect. But something wasn't adding up. "Do you know anyone who would want Marcus dead?" he asked. For the first time, Eleanor hesitated. "No," she said finally. It was a lie. Briggs left the Whitmore estate with more questions than answers. Eleanor had the motive. Rage, betrayal, jealousy. But did she have the means? If she didn't kill Marcus herself, did she have someone do it for her? As he drove back to the precinct, his phone buzzed. It was the forensic team. "Detective, we found something." There was a single fingerprint on a whiskey glass in the victim's apartment. Briggs frowned. "And?" "It belongs to Eleanor Whitmore." Briggs exhaled. The widow had been there. She had lied. Detective Samuel Briggs sat in his dimly lit office, the glow from his desk lamp casting shadows across the forensic report. Eleanor Whitmore's fingerprint had been found in Marcus Green's apartment. It wasn't just any fingerprint. It was on a whiskey glass, meaning she had been comfortable, seated, drinking, present. She had lied to him. Briggs picked up the phone and called his partner, Detective Lisa Monroe, a sharp investigator with a talent for reading people. "Lisa, we've got a problem," he said. "Eleanor Whitmore told me she hadn't seen Marcus the night he was killed, but forensics just put her inside his apartment." Lisa let out a low whistle. "That's bold. A woman like her, thinking she's untouchable? She's old money. She probably thinks she is untouchable." "You bringing her in?" "Not yet. She's too careful. We need more." Lisa exhaled. "All right, I'll start digging. But I've got a feeling this isn't just about a love affair gone wrong." The next day, Briggs returned to Eleanor's estate. This time, he wasn't here for polite questioning. He had evidence. The grand gates opened, and he was led inside to the same lavish sitting room, where Eleanor sat waiting, dressed in an elegant black dress, a pearl necklace resting just above her collarbone. "Detective," she said smoothly, crossing one leg over the other. "Back so soon?" Briggs didn't bother with pleasantries. He pulled out the forensic report and set it on the table between them. "You told me you weren't at Marcus's apartment the night he was killed," he said, "but your fingerprint was found on a whiskey glass in his living room." For the first time, Eleanor's expression flickered. Just for a second. Then she leaned back in her chair, unbothered. "I suppose I should have been more specific," she said, reaching for her tea. "I was there earlier that evening, but I left. When I said I wasn't there when he was killed, I wasn't lying." Briggs folded his arms. "When exactly did you leave?" "Around 8:30. You expect me to believe that?" She sighed, shaking her head. "Detective, what exactly are you accusing me of?" "Murder." The room fell silent. Eleanor set her teacup down with a soft clink. "That's a dangerous accusation," she said coolly. "One that could ruin reputations. Are you sure you want to go down that road?" Briggs wasn't intimidated. He had faced powerful people before, and he knew the tricks they played. "You had motive," he continued. "You found out Marcus was married. You felt humiliated, betrayed. You had the means. Old money buys a lot of things, including silence. And now I have evidence placing you at the scene." Eleanor held his gaze for a long moment. Then, to his surprise, she smiled. "Detective," she said softly, "do you really think I pulled the trigger?" Briggs narrowed his eyes. "No," he admitted, "but I think you had someone do it for you." Briggs left the Whitmore estate knowing one thing for sure. Eleanor Whitmore wasn't just lying. She was playing a game. She had something to hide, but she wasn't worried. That meant one thing. She believed she had covered her tracks. Back at the precinct, Lisa Monroe was already deep into Eleanor's financials. "You were right," she said when Briggs walked in. "There's a money trail." Briggs sat down. "Talk to me." Lisa pulled up a bank statement on her laptop. "Eleanor made a large cash withdrawal a week before the murder. $50,000. Briggs whistled. "That's a lot of money to just disappear." "Exactly. And get this. One of her known associates is a guy named Vince Calloway, former military dishonorable discharge turned private security contractor." Briggs's jaw tightened. "You think she hired him?" Lisa nodded. "We don't have proof yet, but a guy like Vince doesn't come cheap." Briggs leaned back. Eleanor Whitmore might not have pulled the trigger, but she had set the pieces in motion. And now he had a name. That night, Briggs and Lisa drove across town to a rundown bar on the outskirts of Charleston. It was the kind of place where men like Vince Calloway spent their time. Dark, full of cigarette smoke, and always one bad decision away from a fight. They spotted him at the bar nursing a whiskey, mid-40s, rugged, with the kind of build that suggested he had seen his fair share of violence. Briggs and Lisa approached, flashing their badges. "Vince Calloway?" Briggs asked. Vince barely looked up. "Depends who's asking. Detectives Briggs and Monroe, Charleston, PD." Vince smirked. "Well, this just got interesting." Lisa folded her arms. "We need to talk about Eleanor Whitmore." At the mention of her name, Vince's expression shifted. Just a little, but enough for Briggs to catch it. "What about her?" he asked, playing it cool. "We know she withdrew a large sum of cash before Marcus Green was murdered," Briggs said. "And we know she's connected to you." Vince chuckled. "You think I killed that jazz player? Did you?" Vince took a slow sip of his drink before setting it down. "Let's just say, people like Eleanor don't get their hands dirty. They pay others to do it for them." Lisa leaned in. "And did she pay you?" Vince smirked again, but this time it didn't reach his eyes. "If I did, you wouldn't be able to prove it." Briggs's gut told him Vince was involved, but proving it, that would be harder. As they left the bar, Lisa turned to Briggs. "He's guilty as hell." Briggs nodded. "Yeah, but we need to find the smoking gun." And that meant one thing, following the money. If they could tie the payment from Eleanor to Vince, they could break the case wide open. The widow thought she had planned the perfect crime, but she was about to find out no crime is ever truly perfect. Detective Samuel Briggs wasn't the kind of cop who believed in coincidences. Eleanor Whitmore's perfect alibi had too many convenient gaps, and Vince Calloway, her muscle for hire, was too smug for a man with nothing to hide. Briggs sat in his office, staring at the evidence board. Marcus Green was dead, shot execution style in his own apartment. Eleanor had motive, Vince had the skill, and $50,000 had disappeared from Eleanor's bank account just days before the murder. The missing piece? A direct link between the two. Briggs and Lisa Monroe spent the next day pulling every record they could find on Vince Calloway. His past was littered with violence. Bar fights, a few assault charges that never stuck, and a shady career in private security. But it wasn't his criminal past that caught their attention. It was his bank statements. Lisa tapped on her laptop screen. Vince deposited $45,000 in cash into an offshore account 2 days after Marcus was killed. That's almost the exact amount Eleanor withdrew. Briggs nodded. She paid him. We just need to make him admit it. They brought Vince in that night. He didn't look surprised when he was escorted into the interrogation room. He slouched in the chair, arms crossed, grinning like a man who had nothing to lose. Briggs dropped the printed bank statements on the table. You were paid after Marcus Green was murdered. Vince didn't even blink. Prove it. Lisa leaned forward. The offshore account is in your name. We have the records. Vince smirked. Doesn't mean I killed anyone. Briggs sighed, feigning boredom. We're not here for you, Vince. We're here for Eleanor. That wiped the smirk off his face. She hired you, didn't she? Briggs pressed. We know you took the money, and right now you're the one looking at a murder charge. But if you help us... He let the sentence hang. Vince's jaw tightened. He wasn't stupid. He knew the cops had him in a corner. Finally, he leaned back, exhaling. I didn't pull the trigger. Lisa narrowed her eyes. Then who did? Vince ran a hand over his face. I don't know. All I know is that Eleanor wanted him gone. She was pissed, real pissed. Said he made a fool out of her. Briggs exchanged a glance with Lisa. They had been right all along. Eleanor hadn't killed Marcus herself. She had orchestrated it. But they still needed proof. Eleanor Whitmore had spent her life in control. She had built her reputation on power, wealth, and the belief that money could bury any problem. But even the wealthiest people made mistakes. Briggs knew her ego would be her downfall. The next morning, they showed up at the Whitmore estate again. This time, Eleanor wasn't as welcoming. She greeted them in a deep navy dress, her expression cool but wary. Detectives, she said, folding her hands in front of her. Back again? Briggs didn't waste time. Vince Calloway rolled on you. For the first time, Eleanor's mask cracked. Lisa stepped forward. He told us everything. That you wanted Marcus dead, that you paid him. Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line. That's absurd. Briggs leaned in. The bank records say otherwise. Eleanor stayed silent for a long moment, then let out a breath. I paid Vince, she admitted. But not to kill Marcus. Briggs raised an eyebrow. Then what for? To scare him. Lisa folded her arms. You're telling us you just wanted to scare him, but then he ended up dead? Eleanor lifted her chin. That's exactly what I'm saying. I never told Vince to kill him. Briggs wasn't buying it. Why did you hire him at all? Eleanor's voice grew cold. Because Marcus betrayed me. She stood, walking to the large window overlooking her estate. Do you know what it feels like to be humiliated, detective? She asked, her voice laced with bitterness. I gave him everything, and he laughed behind my back. Briggs kept his tone steady. So you wanted revenge? Eleanor turned, her eyes sharp. I wanted respect. Briggs sighed. Mrs. Whitmore, you can keep spinning this any way you want, but the truth is, you paid to have Marcus dealt with. Whether you said the words or not, you knew what Vince was capable of. Eleanor remained silent. Lisa crossed her arms. Do you know what's going to happen next? We're pulling every camera near Marcus's apartment, every streetlight, every business. If you send someone else, we'll find them. Eleanor's fingers twitched just for a second. Briggs caught it. Who did you send? He asked quietly. Eleanor's face hardened. You have no proof. Briggs studied her. Not yet. That night, Briggs and Lisa combed through security footage from the night of the murder. They had already confirmed Eleanor's alibi. She was at the gala. But someone else had gone to Marcus's apartment. It took hours, but at 10:37 p.m., they found it. A black sedan pulled up a block away from Marcus's building. A man stepped out, his face hidden by a hoodie, and walked inside. 7 minutes later, he ran out. Lisa zoomed in on the plates. Briggs's stomach tightened. The news of Eleanor Whitmore's arrest spread through Charleston like wildfire. The wealthy widow, known for her high society connections and philanthropy, was now the prime suspect in a murder-for-hire case. The media ate it up. Headlines screamed about betrayal, power, and deception. Murder in high society, the fall of Eleanor Whitmore. Wealth, lies, and a deadly affair from ballrooms to jail cells. The heiress who ordered a hit. The city was divided. Some refused to believe Eleanor could be capable of something so brutal. Others whispered about how she had always been ruthless, using her money to keep her hands clean. But no amount of influence could stop what was coming. The case against her was strong. Daniel Royce, her personal assistant, had confessed to pulling the trigger, but claimed Eleanor ordered it. Vince Calloway, the hired fixer, had admitted she paid for a problem to go away. The financial records showed her withdrawal of $50,000 just days before the murder. Still, Eleanor wasn't backing down. Her defense team, some of the best lawyers money could buy, argued that she was being framed, that Daniel had acted on his own, that Vince was lying to save himself, that the prosecution was twisting the story to make a spectacle out of an innocent woman. But Detective Samuel Briggs knew the truth, and he was going to make sure Eleanor Whitmore finally faced justice. The prosecution team, led by District Attorney Karen Holloway, knew this would be one of the toughest trials in Charleston's history. Eleanor's lawyers were experienced, ruthless, and backed by an endless supply of money. Briggs and Lisa Monroe spent weeks working with the DA's office, ensuring every piece of evidence was airtight. The financial trail, the security footage of Daniel arriving at Marcus's apartment, the phone records showing Eleanor's calls to both Vince and Daniel before and after the murder, and the most damning piece, the recorded confession from Daniel Royce. But they needed to make sure Eleanor wouldn't slip through the cracks, because people like her, they didn't go down without a fight. The courtroom was packed on the first day. Reporters, spectators, and high-profile Charleston elites filled the seats. Eleanor Whitmore entered dressed in an elegant gray suit, her silver hair pinned back, her expression calm. She wasn't panicked. She wasn't afraid. She was still playing the part of a woman wrongfully accused. The prosecution's opening statement was simple. Eleanor Whitmore thought she could buy her way out of everything, including murder. But today we will prove that justice cannot be bought. The defense fired back, painting Eleanor as a victim of manipulation. They claimed Daniel had acted alone, that Vince was fabricating his testimony to save himself, and that the case was built on circumstantial evidence. But Briggs knew the truth was on their side. And then the real battle began. The moment Daniel Royce was sworn in, the tension in the courtroom thickened. He looked exhausted, his once pristine appearance now replaced by the weight of guilt. Briggs watched as he avoided Eleanor's gaze. "Mr. Royce," the DA began, "can you tell the court how you became involved in the murder of Marcus Green?" Daniel's voice was shaky but clear. "I was following orders." The defense lawyer immediately objected. "Speculation, sustained," the judge ruled. "Stick to what you know, Mr. Royce." Daniel swallowed. "Eleanor told me Marcus had humiliated her. She was furious. She said he needed to be taught a lesson. And what did you take that to mean?" Daniel hesitated. "That he needed to be scared." The DA nodded. "And what happened when you got to his apartment?" Daniel's hands trembled slightly. "He got aggressive. He was yelling, pushing me. I pulled the gun to make him back off, but then he lunged at me. I panicked." His voice cracked. "And I shot him." The courtroom was silent. The defense tried to poke holes in his story, pushing the idea that Daniel had acted on his own and was trying to shift the blame. But when they asked him if Eleanor ever instructed him not to hurt Marcus, Daniel shook his head. "She never told me to stop." Vince Calloway's testimony was less emotional, but just as damning. He confirmed that Eleanor had paid him, that she had been furious about Marcus's betrayal, and that she had specifically said Marcus would pay for what he did. When asked if Eleanor explicitly said to kill Marcus, Vince smirked. She didn't have to. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs. Eleanor sat motionless, her expression unreadable. When Eleanor took the stand, her lawyers had prepared her well. She played the role of a heartbroken woman, manipulated by the men around her. She admitted to being angry at Marcus but denied ever ordering a hit. "I would never want him dead," she said, voice perfectly measured. "Yes, I was hurt. Yes, I may have spoken in anger, but I never, ever ordered anyone to harm him." The conviction of Eleanor Whitmore sent shockwaves through Charleston. The wealthy elite, once accustomed to whispering her name with reverence, now spoke it in hushed, scandalized tones. The media feasted on the downfall of one of the city's most powerful women. The widow behind bars, Eleanor Whitmore's life sentence. Justice for Marcus Green. A lover betrayed, a killer unmasked, money can't buy freedom, how a high society heiress fell for Detective Samuel Briggs. The case was over, but its ripples were still felt. Inside the South Carolina Women's Correctional Facility, Eleanor Whitmore was no longer the untouchable socialite. She was inmate number 78,456, stripped of her designer suits and pearls, dressed in a standard-issue jumpsuit. Her world had shrunk from a sprawling estate to a cold, gray cell. She spent her days in silence, ignoring the jeers of other inmates who recognized her from the news. Some admired her, seeing her as a woman who had wielded power until it crumbled. Others despised her, a rich, racist widow who had taken a life because she couldn't accept betrayal. But Eleanor refused to show weakness. She still held on to the belief that an appeal would save her, that somehow her lawyers would find a way to get her out. But time passed, and the world outside moved on without her. At a press conference following the verdict, Marcus Green's younger sister Ava addressed the public. "My brother was more than just a story," she said, holding back tears. "He was a man who deserved to live. He was smart, kind, and had his whole life ahead of him." Eleanor Whitmore thought she could take that away without consequences. But today she learned that justice doesn't care about money. It doesn't care about power. Her words resonated beyond Charleston, sparking conversations about wealth, privilege, and race in America. Many in the Black community saw Marcus's case as a rare moment when the system worked. Too often, powerful people like Eleanor walked away free, but not this time. The Whitmore family name, once a symbol of old money prestige, was now tainted. Eleanor's former friends distanced themselves. Charities quietly removed her name from plaques. Some of her former business partners liquidated her assets, eager to separate themselves from her disgrace. Her estate, including the Grand Whitmore mansion, was auctioned off to pay for her legal fees. Briggs heard rumors that a developer planned to turn it into a luxury hotel. Fitting, he thought. Eleanor had spent her life clinging to her status. Now strangers would drink cocktails where she once hosted elite galas. Vince Calloway adjusted to prison life quickly. He had been in and out of the system before, and 10 years was a small price to pay for avoiding a murder charge. He knew he'd be out before he was 50, and that was good enough for him. Daniel Royce, however, struggled. He had never been a hardened criminal, just a man who made the mistake of believing in the wrong person. 25 years loomed over him like a life sentence. He spent his days avoiding trouble, keeping his head down, and replaying that night in his mind. No amount of regret could undo what he had done. With the case closed, Samuel Briggs and Lisa Monroe returned to their usual workload. But something about the Whitmore case stuck with them. Briggs had worked high-profile cases before, but this one had exposed the dark underbelly of wealth and privilege in a way he hadn't seen before. Eleanor hadn't killed Marcus out of passion. She had orchestrated his death because she believed she could. Lisa, younger and still full of fire, saw it as a lesson. "They always think they're untouchable," she said one evening at the precinct. "Until they're not." Briggs nodded. "And it's our job to remind them of that." Months later, Briggs found himself driving past the old Whitmore estate. The mansion was dark, abandoned, waiting for its next owner. For years, it had been a symbol of power. Now it was just another empty house, its former occupant rotting in a prison cell. Briggs thought of Marcus Green, young, full of life, taken too soon. Justice had been served, but it had come too late to save him. With a sigh, Briggs pulled away from the curb, heading back to the city. There would always be another case, another crime, another person who thought they were above the law. But as long as he was around, he'd make sure they learned otherwise. Because no one, not even Eleanor Whitmore, was truly untouchable. Months turned into years, but the case of Eleanor Whitmore never truly faded. It remained a landmark trial in Charleston's history, a rare instance where wealth and privilege failed to bend the system. For those directly affected, however, the scars never fully healed. From her prison cell, Eleanor Whitmore clung to the belief that her appeal would set her free. Her legal team, still well-funded by what remained of her assets, exhausted every avenue. They argued that Daniel Royce's confession was coerced, that Vince Calloway had fabricated his testimony for a lighter sentence, that Eleanor's voicemail was taken out of context. But in the end, none of it mattered. The appellate court upheld her conviction. Eleanor received the news in a dimly lit prison office, her lawyer's voice cracking through the static of a prison phone. "It's over, Eleanor." For the first time in her life, she had no control. She hung up, staring at the gray walls around her. This was her life now. Not the ballrooms, not the estates, not the whispered admiration of Charleston's elite, just the steady hum of fluorescent lights, the dull clang of metal doors, and the knowledge that she would die in a cage. For a woman who once believed she was untouchable, it was a fate worse than death. While Eleanor's world crumbled, Marcus Green's name lived on, not just as a victim, but as a man whose story ignited change. His sister Ava Green turned her grief into action. She founded the Marcus Green Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to advocating for justice reform and supporting young Black men in underserved communities. "We can't bring Marcus back," she said at the foundation's launch, "but we can make sure no one else suffers the way he did." The foundation gained national attention, drawing donations from across the country. Celebrities, activists, and everyday people rallied behind the cause. Marcus had been stolen from the world too soon, but his name would never be forgotten. Behind bars, Vince Calloway thrived. He had connections, respect, and a reputation that kept most trouble away. By the time he was released on parole after 8 years, he walked out with the same smirk he had worn in the interrogation room. For him, it had just been business. Daniel Royce, however, withered. He served his time quietly, avoiding confrontation, haunted by the choice that had sealed his fate. Every day he replayed that night in his mind, the moment he pulled the trigger, the way Marcus had fallen, the blood, the silence. He would serve every day of his 25-year sentence, and in his heart, he knew he deserved it. Detective Samuel Briggs sat at his desk, flipping through case files, when Lisa Monroe dropped a fresh report in front of him. "Homicide on the South Side," she said. "Looks like a bad one." Briggs glanced at her. "Worse than the Whitmore case?" Lisa let out a dry laugh. "Nothing will ever be that messy." They grabbed their coats and headed out, ready to chase another killer. Briggs had long since stopped believing in true justice. The world was too broken for that. But every so often, a case like Marcus Green's came along. A case that proved money and power couldn't bury the truth forever, and that was enough to keep him going. As they stepped into the cool Charleston night, Briggs took one last look at the city skyline. There would always be another case, another victim, another person who thought they could get away with murder. But as long as he was around, justice would never be for sale.